reprioritization of their public expenditure, right, clearly is having a huge impact on the work of the United Nations, from humanitarian operation to peacekeeping to development cooperation. And the impact is quite profound, I would say. Just one example, 120 million people are forcibly displaced out of their homes, right? And if you look at global humanitarian crisis, the humanitarian appeals for funding normally is only 20 to 30% met. The needs are met about at 20 to 30% level. I personally visited Gaza and stayed overnight with our colleagues, right, to support our colleagues to again deliver much needed humanitarian support. From the E-wing to co-wing during COVID, right, to now U-wing, right, for child and mothers and infants health care, right. This again is a example of success of cooperation.
These are real testing times for the world. We are looking at starvation, of hunger, of problems in development because of conflicts, because of war, and because of what governments are doing. To discuss this and more, I'm being joined in an exclusive conversation by Mr. Haoliang. He is the UN Under-Secretary General and Acting UNDP Administrator. Thank you so much, Mr. Xu, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Let's begin with what is the most difficult thing right now that UNDP and the United Nations really are dealing with, and that has to do with funding. Very important for your development projects, very important for how you see and how UN can really contribute in various countries. With the decision by Trump administration to withdraw funds, to freeze funds, how has that really impacted the organization in your development efforts across the world?
The reduction of official development assistance from quite a number of developed countries because of reprioritization of their public expenditure, right, clearly is having a huge impact on the work of the United Nations, from humanitarian operation to peacekeeping to development cooperation. And the impact is quite profound, I would say. The ODA, for example, from last year to this year, will reduce by an estimated 17%, right? And from $250 billion to below $200 million, I think, around that range. And when you consider the financing gap, SDG financing gap every year is about $4.3 trillion, right? So any significant reduction of ODA, is going to add to what is already quite a challenging financing situation. So I think it is affecting our work, but there are, solutions. It's not easy, but if we work together, we can find some solutions to deal with the impact.
Are the SDG goals being impacted because of this, the Sustainable Development Goals?
Before even this round of reductions, right, from quite a number of countries, right, have come. The SDG progress was already not very promising. In September this year, the latest SDG progress report indicated that only 35% of the SDG targets are either on track or having modest progress. That means the world is not really on track to achieve the SDGs. So clearly, reduction of official development assistance, which is catalytic, right, which is very important, is not helpful. Right? This said, the majority of the funding ultimately have to come from the developing country governments themselves, right, and also from both public and private resources. Right? If you're considering the kind of financing gap that exists, $4.3 trillion a year, even you have a full extent of ODA, let's say $200 billion a year, it's not even close, right, to filling the gap. So there has to be some other areas where we should work on to really create the kind of fiscal space that's necessary.
Okay. The United Nations, Mr. Chu, has always been hailed as an organization and a body, or used to be hailed as an organization and a body that brought countries together. But today we are seeing growing polarization amongst countries, countries taking sides, seeking humanitarian aid for one and not for the other. In such a scenario, how difficult has humanitarian aid and effectively working towards the betterment of various countries become? I ask you this is because we do know that countries, whether it's the P5 or whether it's the developing world, have taken sides and have chosen sides. If you could elaborate on what that really means.
I think at this time, the humanitarian burden is extremely heavy, right? And we have, the very high levels of geopolitical tensions, right? We have the highest number of conflicts in decades, right? We're impacted by, climate crisis that does not recognize the border, right? And in terms of humanitarian needs, just one example, 120 million people are forcibly displaced out of their homes, right? And if you look at global humanitarian crisis, the humanitarian appeals for funding normally is only 20 to 30% met. The needs are met about at 20 to 30% level. So clearly, more support is needed. But at the same time, everybody recognizes that humanitarian assistance alone will not get countries or people in need out of crisis. That's why development cooperation, investing in development really is more important than ever. One thing we're trying to do with governments around the world is to look at how we can link different sources of financing to development priorities, including conflict prevention, peace building efforts, right? By looking at all sorts of funding. And for example, again, the point I want to make is that money actually is available. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. The world has $460 trillion of wealth under management of big firms, right? And we're talking about $4.3 trillion of financing gap for development every year, but we have $2.7 trillion of military expenditure last year, and it's increasing, right? It's if the pace of increase continues, we may have more than $6 trillion of military expenditure a year by 2035, for example, right? But also, another challenge, right, that the world is facing, not only in developing countries, but really across the board, is how much public resources lost due to, corruptions, for example, right? Globally, every year, we have a $13 trillion worth of public procurement. According to UN ODC statistics, 10 to 25% of that is lost due to corruption. So we're talking about 1.3 to 2.67 trillion dollars of money that's lost. Just imagine if you put this money in good use, plus the military expenditures, it's more than enough to fill the financing gap, right, for development. So I think the world can have choices, right? But of course, the primary responsibility to plan to execute development priorities and development objectives, do rest with the governments, right? And of course, the population, the society, working together. So I think the UN is trying to play a catalytic role in this process by supporting governments, by supporting civil society organizations in partnership with the private sector, with academia, working together to find the solutions, right? So it's not easy, but it can be done. There are examples where, success, has been achieved.
Share some examples.
In the last few years, after the, conflict, with the, the international coalition against the ISIS, the war against the terror, ended. UNDP, working with a set of, donor countries, with the Iraqi government, right? We implemented 3,600 or 3,500, projects of different kinds, at local level, infrastructure, governance, right? Building hospitals, schools, health clinics, and public buildings, right? Livelihoods, support to population, and these efforts, with the expenditure of about $3.5 billion over the last few years, have allowed nearly 5 million displaced people to move back to their homes. And this effort has benefited in total about 6 million people in the regions that have been rebuilt, for example. This is one example that's been built. Talking about Gaza, right? In Gaza, since January this year, UNDP has again worked with the Palestinian authority, with the local administrations, right, to deal with the question of debris removal, right? Because removal of debris from public roads, right, is critical for ensuring humanitarian access, for example, right? And we have moved more than 81,000 tons of solid waste and debris from public sites.
From inside Gaza?
From inside Gaza, right.
Does UN have access to Gaza right now?
We operated throughout the last 2 years during the time of war. I personally visited Gaza and stayed overnight with our colleagues, right, to support our colleagues to again deliver much needed humanitarian support to the population in needs.
How was the situation when you visited? Was it
dangerous?
Very
challenging, extremely challenging, right? So, but the UNDP is trying to use our development DNA, right, to support humanitarian operation, to lessen the burdens of humanitarian assistance. One example is the water, right? Now we are using solar-powered, water desalination stations to provide drinking water to about 300,000 people a day, right? And debris removal is one thing that's critical for humanitarian access. For example, another project we did is, public, solid waste management. Because if you don't process these solid waste, which are, really, everywhere, right? Because there are, tent cities, everywhere. You actually, may face a situation of public disease outbreak, right? Because of sanitation conditions, right? So this needed to be processed. And we also supported, thousands of people to have employment, emergency employment, doctors, nurses, right, private sector entrepreneurs, and public sector workers, municipal workers, so that they can work, earn income with dignity, right, and also provide extremely needed services of different kinds to the population. So there are a lot of things we can do to contribute to building peace, right? To achieve ultimately the goals of sustainable development.
Can I stay on a little bit more in the conflict areas, because you talked about the challenges and the environment you work in. You've already visited Gaza. The post-conflict settings right now, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Syria, the United Nations your access to these places has been limited to quite an extent by countries that control the borders. How difficult has that challenge been? And how difficult is it going to be moving forward? Because we're looking at an entire city razed to the ground. We're looking at Syria that might require huge development. So post-conflict, what are the challenges that you're looking at when the United Nations no longer is the organization of the past, UNDP, that was allowed access easily? Now you have restricted access.
Yes, there are challenges for humanitarian access, right, to deliver support, in terms of conflict. There are these challenges. But United Nations, including UNDP, have been able to obtain access in most of the situations. For example, in Gaza, I mentioned, right, we operate also, of course, in the entire occupied Palestinian territory. We operate in across the countries in different local administrations. In Ukraine, for example, we also have extensive access in Myanmar. Right, we operate in many conflict-affected countries in Africa, and you mentioned I think in Syria, you mentioned,
Syria,
right? Syria.
and maybe Sudan too, because
Sudan as well, right? We are operating, throughout the country, right, to provide the support. Now, our approach is that, in terms of conflict, you really have to look at what you can do to support the resilience of people, right? The self-reliance of people, starting, early recovery activities early on, so that you reduce the need, right, for the population to rely on humanitarian handouts, right? Life-saving humanitarian assistance is critical, right, to save lives, right? Water, food, shelter, medicine, right? But that alone will not, really get people out of a crisis. You need the political solutions, right? You need development activities to create conditions for peace, right? And through livelihood support, right? Through supporting micro and small, businesses, right? Through support to women-headed households, for example, right? And these are activities that will help, build the social, coherence, right? Rebuild the social fabric, right? And also supporting local governance is also critical, right? So while you have, probably, political challenges at national level, but you need to work on what you can do at the local level, right? To enhance, institutional capacity, and supporting civil society. One activity we implemented in Gaza, for example, is to create, safe spaces for NGOs, right, to operate, and for them to provide the social service that population needs, right? So we implemented many different type of activities depending on the needs of the country and the conditions under which we can operate. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Shu, let's zoom out a little. There are a lot of other issues that now UNDP looks at as dealing with various countries, inflation, rising costs, slower growth. How is UNDP as a developing partner navigating these spaces with various governments?
Again, I think, if you look at the 80 years of the UN, right, looking back at the 80s of the UN, and also UNDP was created 60 years ago, right? If you looking at the UNDP's journey, of the last 60 years, I would think that we have a lot to celebrate, right? The world is not where we are, what we want to be, right? But the world has moved forward quite a lot, right? We talk about successes, for example. Singapore, right, is a success of development. But in the early 70s, right, UNDP, worked with the government of Singapore, right, to jointly develop, their industrialization, strategy, right, based on which, of course, mainly because of the hardworking commitment and the ingenuity of the Singaporean people, right, the Singaporeans developed. We made a contribution, right. India is another example of, I would say, successful cooperation between, the United Nations and the United Nations Development Program, right, specifically, and the Indian government and the people, right. And one example, Indian Institute of Technology is world famous today, right. And you talk about the IIT, everybody knows, right, the caliber, of the institution. But little, do people know that the first IIT in Karampur was established with the UNDP support in 1971, right? That was the first IIT that was established, right? Again, another example is, this called the White Revolution, right? And the Operation Flood, right? In 1986, I believe, where the Indian government decided to, mount a campaign, right, to increase the production of milk, right, for the health, of the population, right. That again was supported by UNDP, for example, right. So that made today, of course, again because of the effort of the Indian government, right, and the people. Is now India is the largest producer of milk in the world, for example, and also in technology, right? Today, which is celebrated 10 years of digital transformation in the field of health and development, right? From the e-wing to co-wing during COVID, right, to now U-wing, right, for child and mothers and infants health care, right? This again is an example of success of cooperation, which not only is benefiting India, but has also benefited a number of developing countries in other regions in Asia, but also other regions of the world, right? So Indian experience being shared and practiced, adopted in other countries. There's a lot we can celebrate. We just need to do more.
A lot that India can celebrate. You mentioned CoWIN, you mentioned UPI, the digital transformation, and there are a lot of countries that are looking at it. But when you go, in your personal experience, which are the countries that are actually talking about India's digital transformation? Is there any example that you can cite?
Again, so many examples. One example, is Indonesia, which is again a very populous country, a very big country, which adapted the EVIN, platform, for example, right, and developed and adapted to its own ecosystem, and they call it the SMILE, right? Yeah. Every month, for example, 500,000 people use that system, for health services. Just imagine the scale, right? Just one example, right? And so the digital public, infrastructure, right, that India has built, right, the health stack, and the different, kind of, innovations, has tremendous potential to be, adapted and replicated at scale, right, in many other developing countries. In fact, UNDP, is working, the government of India actually tried to look at this. This afternoon, for example, we have a discussion with a number of, Indian institutions to look at how we can make use of the South-South cooperation modality, right, to impart the kind of knowledge and innovation that is made in India, right, and to see how other developing countries can benefit from this.
The one thing that India really talks about every now and again when they're discussing United Nations is the Global South, and that the real representation of the Global South is not seen at this world body. How can the United Nations, whether it's P5 as the high table, the Security Council, or for that matter, every organization that we're looking at, where India contributes a lot, China contributes a lot, but when it comes to return or a say or a voice, there's very little.
The world is changing constantly, and it has changed a lot. Right? I think as the economic power shifts to the east, right, and I guess the kind of discussion about the Security Council reform at the United Nations will also advance, right? But it is a political process that member states are constantly engaged in, right? For our for United Nations development system, right? We see this kind of change as something that is positive, right? Because the traditional models of development cooperation is based on the official development assistance provided by developed countries from so-called the global north, right? Now we know that the ODA is declining, right? For reasons we know, right? So Europe, for example, needs to spend on defense, right? They're prioritizing their assistance, right, to support Ukraine, right? That puts pressure on other expenditures, right, for the ODA. At the same time, right, even if they, keep the current level of ODA, in relative terms, their importance to the needs of the developing countries is also declining, right? Because the economies of developing countries have grown significantly. India is growing at 6-7% a year, right? So any ODA that may be available to India, right, is negligible, right, in terms of in financial terms, right. This is the same for other developing countries, right. So the point is that the traditional models of development cooperation is not going to be sufficient, right, for the needs of the global South. So we have to look at really preserving the kind of ODA that OECD countries are providing, because this funding remains critical for countries that are most vulnerable, right? Because if you cut ODA, the countries that are affected the most are the poorest countries, yes, right? So we needed to, really work with our northern, partners to maintain the level of ODA. which is so critical for small island developing states, right? For least developed countries. So it's really important. And also, even for middle-income countries, the ODA from traditional donors remains catalytic. They can engender changes, right? Engender innovation, right? But that's not enough. So South-South cooperation, but also triangular cooperation, right? The South-South cooperation supported by traditional donors can really play a much important role. India, for example, right, during the India's G20 presidency, brought Africa into the G20. So that is a very important step, right, to increase the voice of the South, right? India also rolled out a number of international initiatives, such as the International Solar Alliance, right, and also the Sustainable Infrastructure Alliance, right, and the digital, public goods, and so these are all, examples where the South is increasing its, inputs, right, to international cooperation. You mentioned India, China, but also other, countries also, increasing the support. For example, Turkey, right, and the Gulf countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, right. They have also increased their support, right, for developing countries. One very concrete example is an agreement we signed during the high-level week of General Assembly in September between UNDP, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar to provide $89 million of support to the government of Syria to maintain critical service provisions to the population, for example. Right? This is one recent example. Right? And the cooperation modality is also changing. In India, the question is that what can UNDP do today, right, to support India when India is developing very fast? India is extremely capable, right? So what is our value added, right? So I think these are the questions that we're looking at all the time, right? And, so how we can work together, right, under the national ownership, national leadership, to get things done, right, at local level, for example, right, to contribute to thought leadership for development strategies, right? So there are a lot of things we can do to collaborate, but we're equal partners. Nobody is a donor to India anymore, right? So I think so there are things that that can still be done effectively to support the development of developing countries.
We are living one example a day, but can we set an example for the world? The UNDP, the Global South, is something we'll have to wait and see. Haoliang Shu, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Geeta.